Hi, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Jerad Alexander to our At Home with Literati series in support of volunteers. He'll be in conversation with David Abrams. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase volunteers from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and a selection will be asked at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in store at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Jerad W. Alexander has written for Esquire, Rolling Stone, and elsewhere. He holds an MFA in Literary Reportage from the New York University Arthur L. Carter School of Journalism. From 1998 to 2006, he served as a U.S. Marine deploying to the Mediterranean, East Africa, and Iraq. He grew up on military bases from the East Coast of the United States to Japan. He currently lives in New York City, but calls Atlanta home. David Abrams' debut novel about the Iraq War, Bobbit, was named the New York Times Notable Book of 2012 and a Best Book of 2012 by Barnes & Noble. It was also featured as part of BNN's Discover Great New Writers program. His short stories have been nominated for the Pushart Prize and have appeared in Esquire, Narrative, Salamander, and the Missouri Review, and many other places. His work has also appeared in New York Times and so on. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jerad and David.
Thanks so much for that. I'll start off with a little reading here. The military was our world. The outside world felt gray and chaotic, shapeless, less noble. There was a quiet, unexpressed notion that we were superior, standing on the ramparts looking down at all the peasants in the muddy, unkempt American ground beyond the moat. We wore the Air Force and the Fighting Falcon like a family crest. The military was our kingdom. With my stepdad and his friends, watching the Fighting Falcons as they darted and hummed overhead in the summer at the end of the Cold War, our castle felt impenetrable. I could feel layers of purpose beneath the daily currents of my American world. Every morning, the airmen like my stepdad and Rye and the rest, dressed in their uniforms, climbed into their cars and trucks or onto their motorcycles and clattered to the offices and hangars and maintenance shops bordering the airfield, where they spent a workday before they turned around and clattered home in the afternoon to supper and beer and the television. But there was something deeper and broader in their energies, even as their workaday routine felt like the cells of a beast at rest, perpetuating itself in perpetuation or in preparation for some far deadlier purpose. Perhaps it was duty or honor or sacrifice, or all the other words we associated then and even now with the act of serving in the military. Perhaps I just wanted it to be. It was certainly woven into the flag we hung every morning in class and hummed somewhere between the words of the Pledge of Allegiance. Everything sparked with righteousness. There was a fantastic sense that we were plugged into the heart of what it meant to be an American. These weapons belonged to us, and every time we touched them or listened to their roar in the sky as I played on the front lawn, it felt like touching our history and future in the same instant. It felt happy and hopeful, warm, gleaming with the sun and the wide open path of the American dream. All I had to do was hold on. It was easy. And when I saw the bumper stickers that blotted the chrome on pickup trucks, a bumper sticker that read "Jet Noise, the sound of freedom," I laughed because I believed it was true.
Well, thank you for reading that, Jerad, and thanks for having this conversation with us tonight.
Thank you.
And especially thanks for writing volunteers. As I was saying beforehand, it's one of my favorite books of the year. I've read quite a dozen of books, and I thought it was an honest and really gut wrenching and really thoughtful, insightful look at truly, like the subtitle says, what it means to grow up in the military. There's a lot of places, a lot of passages in there where, I served 20 years active duty in the military, in the Army. So there are a lot of places where I found myself nodding in recognition. You just really, really spot on captured the military life in all aspects. So let's kind of backtrack a little bit to the beginning. You were kind of bathed in the military from the get-go. You were just raised in that, like you just read in that passage, you were raised in the military tradition. Give us just a very brief synopsis of your military timeline, of your military family tree. I know that your father and your stepfather and your mom were all in the military. But who else? Were there other members?
Well, sure. My family goes back in a genealogical sense to the revolution, on the Alexander side, especially. And then on my mother's side, whose mother is British, there are elements of their experience with the British Army. I know in World War I and II, especially. So there are bits and pieces of my family in every war, I think, just about, perhaps maybe with some exception to maybe some of the smaller ones. But Civil War, Revolution, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. There's just, I can run a lineage back to just about all of those.
Wow.
And it's, but at the same time, it wasn't really a discussed subject. And in a lot of ways, I didn't know about it until I did my own research later and kind of learned by backing into the subject. My kind of military timeline, is from birth forward. It's where it effectively starts. My father was in the Air Force, first as a boom operator and an aerial refueler, and then he became an air traffic controller. My mother was in the Air Force in communications. And then my stepfather was an avionics journeyman, and then he went into intelligence later as an analyst. And then all of their, obviously, every one of their parents were military, or every one of their fathers rather, and stepfathers were all military. And so it just kind of like, it was like a geometric ray. It kind of starts there at birth and goes forward all the way into my time in the Marine Corps, just around it in one variation or another.
Did you feel like it was inevitable that you had to have this, but that you were following this path to follow into the family business?
There was a certain inevitability to it. It wasn't obligatory by any means. Like none of my family, made the suggestion that I had no choice but enlist. But there was just the upbringing itself and being surrounded by enculturation. I just kind of fell into it by virtue of my environment. And then, of course, the stories that I was reading and the imagery that I was sort of devouring, especially as a teenager, it just sort of every little bit sort of added a stone to the foundation of that desire to be in the military.
You were watching a lot of Vietnam War era movies, or there were movies back in the '80s about the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's really big impact on your outlook.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Vietnam War is probably, if I were to dissect it, which I kind of try to do here, Vietnam is a major component of that. Both it's the high art literature that came out of Vietnam from the Tim O'Briens and Tobias Wolffs and going downstream from that, and then of course the films. My veteran friends and I, we still kind of quote Platoon to this day, and they speak of Platoon being sort of a kind of shove them in that direction, which I think is ironic because I don't think that was Stone's intent.
Right.
But the story and the characters that they really recognized, and they especially recognize now, I mean, having gone through that process and then been in their own war, they recognize that some of those characters are somewhat timeless. And
I was going to say they're kind of archetypes too that we've seen in other movies too.
They really are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so you've been steeped in this military tradition in your family in the genealogical sense, but it was a very real choice on your part to join the Marines. Tell us about what your thought process was then and how you felt about joining the military.
My initial intention was, well, I'll start with the Air Force. I was really fascinated with the Air Force when I was a kid, when I was about 8, 9, 10, 11, right in there, up through the Persian Gulf War. And forgive me, there's a racetrack outside my window. So if you hear that, I apologize. But no, I grew up around that. And so that was, I was in high orbit of that, the fighter jets and the sort of swashbuckling fighter with the scarf and that kind of thing, the Top Gun. That sort of character. And as I got older and my interest in the military widened out, I began to experience and seek other aspects of it, and Vietnam is a big part of that. Mm-hmm. And once I did that, I found the Air Force to be, I began to realize that the Air Force on a day-to-day level was quiet. It's and that's just by virtue of what it does. It's right. It's not a dig on the Air Force. It's just kind of how it operates, and it works well for them. But I wanted something a little more earthy, a little more atavistic.
And you got it.
I certainly did. Yeah. And probably more than I wanted in certain respects. But, so I initially, after kind of giving up the Air Force as an option, I started looking at the Army. I was really motivated by stories like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and I read a lot about, the American drive through the Eastern Theater of Operations after D-Day, so Joe Lawton Collins and a lot of the officers and soldiers who fought in that campaign were really fascinating to me. And Grant to this day still is. But I had struggles with the enlistment process. I didn't feel like I was competent enough at the time for college. I was kind of done with school. I later learned that my fears of college were a little bit overgrown, but I just wasn't ready for that. I kind of wanted somebody to just hand me the rifle and let me fall into the story, as I sort of phrase it. But the Army kind of, I did very well in the ASVAB, and the Army kind of wanted to shove me into a technical field, and I toyed around with military intelligence briefly, but they were really reticent and very resistant to put me into the infantry, which is what I wanted. And it was a conveyor belt sort of mentality that the recruiter, was sort of engaging in. And I don't think that that's indicative perhaps of the entire recruiting arm, but that was my experience with that individual. And so I gave up the Army as an option. And then I had to go find the Marine Corps. I had to, it was an article of attraction in a way, because I had to seek them out. They weren't calling me, they weren't looking for me. And in fact, I had to call the Navy, and I called the Navy recruiter, and he got very upset at me for calling him to get the Marine Corps' number. I remember he was very, very upset at me for that. And I had to, the recruiter came to my house, and it was, there's definitely a sales tactic to this, but I had to kind of demonstrate my interest. I had to kind of show him why the Marine Corps, and I still off and on talk to my recruiter to this day. He retired as a sergeant major, and he was a nice guy. Really, really, I felt like he did me a good turn. I didn't have a recruiter that lied to me, quote unquote. He knew where I was coming from and knew what I wanted. And he warned me about the infantry to a degree, but he eventually gave it to me. In fact, I was looking at becoming a correspondent up front, and then but I decided to become an 0311 infantry rifleman. And then 3 weeks after high school, I was gone. I went to Paris Island and just fell right into it, for better or worse. Right.
And so when you entered boot camp, did you kind of have an internal swagger because you'd had all of this kind of training on already with all the background of all the war literature and the movies and of course your family, did you kind of feel like you had a one up on everybody else at first?
Well, I thought I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew a little. I remember I knew a little bit. I knew how to march. I knew how to do close order drill. With some competency. I understood some basic aspects of that, but I was not prepared for just how intense that experience was. I think if I had been in the Army or the Air Force, I think I would have molded to it a lot faster. But the Marine Corps was a very, very different. There was no preparation for it. I think it was very intense.
Yeah,
it's very loud. You become an automaton in that place for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and that lingers even after. I mean, your time is incredibly restricted, and even the way you talk about yourself is restricted. You can't use I. You have to refer to yourself in the third person, and so it was a remarkably intense place, and in certain respects, it was a little bit exhausting. Right. Yeah, I came in there with some, I should be relatively okay here. And to a degree I was, but there were aspects that I found myself remarkably lacking. A lot of it was to be honest, on a social level. It has a very playground-like attitude. It's very much like, the guy who can bonk heads together is probably going to be the guy who carries the day, not because he can do it, but because other people can believe he can. And that gives him a certain credibility. And that was not something that I was prepared for. And I never had any altercations with anybody. It wasn't anything overtly physical, but that was just the sort of pastiche in the environment. You know, it's just the way it was very Lord of the Flies like, you know, very much so, and especially in the junior enlisted ranks. And that was something I had some struggles with. It was not the military that I was used to seeing, and that took some adjustment. I eventually kind of, you know, halfway molded myself around it as a corporal, lance corporal, and adopted a lot of its, you know, some of its attitudes. But early on, it was a struggle.
And so, so after you graduate boot camp and you become a full-fledged Marine, and you talk about the pride that you have of that, and, you know, cruising up the strip down, you know, up and down the strip, and kind of yelling out the cars. But then, so you become a full-fledged Marine, but then later on, jumping a little bit farther ahead here, of course, you're in a position where, you know, we're a nation at war, but you yourself are not part of that war. You're stuck either stateside or else in other deployments that aren't getting you to the front of the war. How did that make you feel at that? You know, having all this training and prepared to go to war, but then you're kind of held back.
That was incredibly gut wrenching. It was probably one of the most, we talk about fear of missing out. It was that feeling amplified by a factor of 10. I mean, it was really much just the thing, the organization I am in is involved in heavy combat in the same way that I was reading about as a teenager, just in a different environment. And it felt like a love denied to not be a part of that. You know, and I saw the invasion of Iraq. You know, I was at the base where a lot of troops who invaded Iraq ended up coming from, and you know, I saw them come home. Some and some were wounded. You know, I would see lance corporals with Purple Hearts and combat action ribbons, and you know, it knocked the stripes right off my sleeve. You know, I was a sergeant by that point, and it put me on my heels. And it sort of amplified my desire to want to go and sort of live up to that, you know. Part of that is because I was a Marine, but also a lot of it was definitely personal, and it was very much, this is what we're here to do. This is why I'm here, and I wanted to be a part of that and explore that. And I felt that if I didn't, it would be like a big hole in the center of my experience.
Right, but then also interspersed throughout your lovely book are these very brief italicized passages that are taking place, you know, in Iraq, even as I'm assuming it's mostly Iraq, even as you're charting the growth of your childhood and teenager and adolescent. But so we're seeing these little snippets of you, you know, how it is for you in Iraq in combat. And we're getting the feeling that maybe there's some changes, maybe there's some of the, as you later say, some of the disillusionment starting to creep in. Maybe not about your specific situation, but about the military in general. Can you talk about that? What it was like?
Sure. You know, I think it was one of these things where that disillusionment was almost in reverse. And I sort of refer to it as a natural terminus to the environment I'm in. You know, it was like, I'm supposed to end up there. And I was to a large degree, but I also knew that that's where I was headed. I could see it occurring. I had some distance from it in a way. And, you know, I remember thinking about Iraq and knowing that what we were doing was effectively my own version of what Vietnam was. Now, obviously the justifications for it and the minutia of that conflict are different, but we're still fighting in a counterinsurgency war under slippery reasons, and there was a lot of, I couldn't help but see the coincidence, and both personally and also nationally, so my time in action, you know, or my time in combat was very much, I was a participant of it, but I was also recognizing myself participating in it. You know, it was like I had spent so much time imagining myself in that place that I kind of wanted to capture it mentally. I wanted to grab every little bit of it. Some of it I do, some of it I don't. And I tried to signal that in places in the book, is like, you know, there are certain things that were traumatic that I kind of remembered and then try not to, and then brought back into the story. And you know, and that's part of I think the experience of war is what's meant, you know, how we handle the memory of it.
Right.
And but you know, yeah, when I was sat down to write it, what I really wanted to do was, like, I wanted to be an observer to combat, and I wanted to be observer to human behavior in it. But what I saw was not what I expected to see. I expected the loud and the yelling and the histrionics of people who are under fire. And what I saw was something a little more subtle. I tend to view combat as sort of like two negative poles of a magnet approaching each other, and the closer they get, the slower they go. Because they don't want to touch each other. They're both two very scared forces approaching each other and clashing against each other. And what I saw in that was people going very slow, people being very methodical, outmaneuvering. There wasn't a lot of the Black Hawk Down stuff. That's a very, very, those are edge case combat. It's very methodical. And
Right.
I also saw a lot of people capturing it, taking pictures of it. Grunts would take out cameras in the middle of an airstrike and photograph the bombs falling. They would take photos of other units or video if they, in this point, because it was it was very easy to get a video camera. There's a lot of footage in my area of people just recording the sounds of firefights. One of the, I guess, cut scenes out of the book is one that didn't kind of was left on the floor was a Marine I knew had recorded on an audio recorder a firefight. And when we got back to the States, he would play it for people and talk about it. He's like, this is what it sounds like. And he was very it was a combination of like an emotional wound, but also a certain awe about it. He's like, I was there and this is what I heard there. And none of it was all that unusual as far as combat goes, but they just wanted to grab pieces of it. They wanted to take pictures of themselves in that place.
So this is like the proverbial war story down at the VFW bar. Instead of the guy, just telling the story, he's whipping out his phone or his and playing,
right.
saying
Right.
this is the war.
Right. I think that a lot of it is there is a kind of, for the lack of a better term, a sort of emotional tourism to that. There's a kind of, I'm on the leading edge of our foreign policy or history in general terms. And I want to, they were recognizing that, and I was too. And I wanted to sort of bottle that a little bit. I wanted to take that home with me to a degree. And like I did this thing. Look, this is things they write books about in 100 years, and I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot of legacy capturing that I saw over there. I mean, in one section of the book, I talk about a lieutenant who comes bursting out of the house to shoot a photograph of an unexploded ordnance demolition, the UXO blowing up. Things like that,
right.
Just, it was a very there's a lot of sense of tourism to it. And that was really astounding, when I
right. Yeah, and I witnessed some of that myself. But apart from that, I was going to ask, did you also keep a journal while you were over there to record some of the details, or are you kind of when it came time to write this book? And we'll talk about writing the book in a minute. But when it came time to write this book, did you just cast back into your memory, or did you have a lot of written material at your hand?
Well, what I did as soon as I got back, I think about a year after I left the Marine Corps in 2006, I started just writing vignettes. I started just writing down things that I thought were really, things that really stuck out to me. And I mean, that was effectively the process of the book. Is I had written a 45,000 word, manuscript that, in my mind, was analogous to like if I die in a combat zone, right? That was kind of what I was angling at, and so I was fresh out of it, and so I was able to capture it. Now, it is not that good. Not even close. I mean, it was a terribly written book, and I'm glad it didn't sell. And
I've got plenty of those myself, so don't worry about it. They're in my drawer.
Yeah, but I use that as and I eventually, this is kind of getting into maybe another question, but I had that core. It gave me something to work with later, and then I can expand on it and grow it and turn it into something more meaningful. So what I did is I just got back and I just wrote about it immediately. Just
kind of a big brain dump.
All right. I also wrote a screenplay on it too. I did both of those. Yeah.
So when did you know that you wanted to coalesce a lot of this material into this book, into Volunteers? When did Volunteers, the book, the memoir, start taking place?
Well, after I wrote that manuscript, I put it away. I began to realize that I needed to kind of relearn how to do this. I also didn't want to write about the war for a long time. I had interest in other forms and other subjects, and so I put it away. I went through undergrad. I didn't do a lot of writing. And then I kind of tapped back into the war with a novella in 2012. And then I had some pressures from folks to put my words in, to write nonfiction about the war, but I had a real love for fiction, and I still do. And I was thinking about fiction that I could maybe write some sort of angle into the war in a novel, or just the subject of war in general terms. But I'd also become a little bit, quite frankly, a little jaded at the reception of war stories, and so I just kind of went a different direction. I started reading a lot of Carver and sort of aping Carver and short stories to a degree. And I got a few things published, and I was grateful for that. But I guess about 2015, I had a very similar trajectory. What got me into writing was me reading, like as an idea of a profession, was my high school, my senior year, before I went to the Marine Corps. I read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It was a movie was coming out at that time, and I read the book, and I never read anything like it. Now, Hunter Thompson's, got his own style there,
Right.
but it showed me what you could do with a sentence, and how to work a paragraph to a degree. And it opened the door for me, because I started reading Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese and Didion, and then eventually that translated and I eventually got into fiction after that in a serious way. And so in 2015, I reread his book Hell's Angels, which is a very serious piece of journalism, on that motorcycle club. It's his first book. And that opening section where he talks about the run to Bass Lake, he kind of opens the book with this high speed run with motorcycles going, and gives a little bit of, the sort of how they're perceived in culture a little bit. But I like the energy in it. I had a lot of octane to it. And so I sat down and I wrote 10,000 words. And what they are is the first italicized section of Volunteers. That mission where those Humvees go out and get into a firefight. Because a lot of my thoughts about the war were like, they were split between anti-war and also a certain understanding that the people who do it are not anti-war. The guys on the machine gun, they there is a certain thrill to that, and they kind of lean into it, especially Marines. And so I wanted to strike a balance between those two. Like, there's a certain caveman animalism to the military, or to the Marine Corps, especially as combat arms. And I don't mean that to be denigrating. It's just kind of how it is. It's very much a atavistic field. And I wanted to try to grab that a little bit. And so I wrote these 10,000 words with the idea of, let's go and write a book about the Marine Corps. Like, let's with my own experiences, and also just as sort of a cultural examination of that, of what that's like. And then I started realizing that I had to talk about myself into that. And when I did, childhood came up. And I was like, okay, how do you create this person? And once that happened, after that, the war began to shifted. The Marine Corps rather started to take a different tone. It started to get shoved into a different corner. And I began to realize, and then of course I went to school, I got an MFA, and I began to learn a little bit more about, appealing to the reader to a certain extent, and understanding like how a reader is going to engage with this, and also being very honest about the emotions that I was experiencing at the time. And the tenor began to change, and the child kind of grew. I began to realize that the real important story is, to me, is the creation of the individual who goes off to fight a war, rather than the person who actually does it. And so that's kind of the genesis of that, in a very, very long-winded way.
Yeah, and I think you really captured something that I think was really fresh about this book for me, was that creation of that individual. I hate to put you in clinical character terms, but yeah, the creation of an individual who is, like I said, birthed and steeped in war, and then goes off, as expected, to war. But then when they get there, there's a lot more. Well, not just when you get there, of course, but you put a lot of thought into war, why we go to war, why we continue to fight wars. One of my favorite quotes is, let me read it. I don't want to butcher it. Children are now fighting the wars of their parents. If the point of going to war is to prevent it for future generations, then we've failed. So there's some beautiful sentences in there like that. I just
Thank you.
really like those. So, So I think that's kind of the extent of a lot of the questions that I had. I don't know if there are any questions that the bookstore has gotten for Jerad, or if there's anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't cover, Jerad.
I don't think so. I would definitely say that one of the things that really fascinated me about this was I wanted to find, like I said before, I wanted to ride the line of the contradictions between people who fight in the wars and the ideas about staying out of them. That was something that really people have asked me, like, do you struggle with those contradictions? I said, not right. And I say, not really. I want to lean into them because I think that there's a lot to be said about human nature right there. And that sort of oscillation between atavism and humanity that really makes up what a human being is. That's something that really fascinates me. And I hope that I tried really hard to get that, to just, do a slalom down that middle line between those 2 points.
Right. Like I said, this is the last chapter, especially, is just a thoughtful dissection of the nature of war and fighting and soldiers and service members. So yeah, very well done.
Thanks.
It looks like we have a couple questions from our audience members. A reminder that you can submit more through the Q&A feature in your toolbar. So the first question is, Jerad, what a tremendous book, an incredible story with some incredible writing. Of many great lines, one sticks out to me about you, waiting for the news to tell us what war to fight. End quote. To what extent did you feel powerless despite all the firepower at your disposal?
It's a great question. I think where I felt powerless, I think that, I talk a lot about, I have a few sections on the roadside bomb. And one area that I really felt where the fear was really hard to contain. You felt it in the background. There's a lot of different ways of getting wounded or killed. There's sniper fire, mortar fire, machine guns, hand-to-hand, whatever, pick one. But the one that really put its hooks in me and really, shortened my breath was always mines and IEDs. Either stepping on them physically with my person or having a vehicle, or more specifically, having a vehicle roll over them that I was sitting in. I don't even like being a passenger in a car. I like to drive the thing, and so I'm in the backseat of a Humvee typically, or maybe in the passenger seat. And in a couple of cases where I was a vehicle commander, and you were kind of at the whim of the driver and your own ability to see a pothole that looked funny. And if you tripped one of those things, there was a high likelihood you were going to get wounded. And that was terrifying to me. I'll give you an example. There was one instance where it was right after somebody had been killed with an IED, not but long after. We rolled into this camp and an outpost. And right in the center of the outpost, the bulldozers that were carving out the confines of this outpost in the middle of the city had uncovered an old mine. And we rolled over the top of this mine as we came in before it was spotted. The battalion commander went out there and looked down and pointed at it and just kind of stood there and then called his engineer officer over to drag it off and blow it. He did, about 20 minutes later it was done. And I remember looking at that thing and I just, that thing it was, I don't know if it was an anti-tank mine, but it was a landmine. And if it had gone off, it would have, ruptured that armor underneath that vehicle and it probably would have wounded me. And I had a couple of close calls or just kind of missed those events, like a vehicle that I was in that firefight with in the very beginning of the book. That lieutenant and those Marines ended up tripping an IED after I left them on their neck. I'd gone on to report that story, and they go back out into the field. They caught a mine, and one of the Marines that I was with took a piece of metal bar to the leg and was evacuated and sent home. Him and another guy, and out of that vehicle, two of those four were wounded and sent home. Not but a week later, and I'd had a couple of incidences where I just brushed with it, and so talk about a lack of control. It sits right there, right, probably the biggest one.
I think that was one of the worst aspects of the war in Iraq, especially in the urban war, is the invisible nature of it, the uncertainty of it. Like you said, that you just never know. You're never going out for just a drive, right?
Right. I mean, Tim O'Brien does a great job with that and the things they carried. And If I'd Had a Combat Zone, he talks about walking the Quang Ngai province, and every boot fall is an act of courage.
Right.
He got that dead on right. It absolutely is.
We have another question from the audience. In your opinion, is there such a thing as a quote moral equivalent of war? Is that possible? Is there something about war that will never let go of its hold of young men and women?
I don't think so. I think that I think that this needs to be studied as an aspect of humanity. So Martha Gellhorn, the famous correspondent who did amazing work during World War II and the Spanish Civil War, and even after, she in her collection, The Face of War, she calls war a disease, and I've always had struggles with that as a concept. That suggests that it is a pathogen that affects the human body, and then the symptoms of that are us killing each other, as if it's some kind of extra, some sort of outside agent rather. But we do this. What that metaphor does is gives us a pass. Effectively, it allows us to sort of look away from it and go, well, that we weren't in our right minds when we were doing that. We were influenced by one thing or another. But really, it's just us. We do this to ourselves. And I think that looking at it in that way, looking at it as a psychological, maybe even a spiritual component to human nature, gives us a little bit of a window on how we behave as people. And if we can look at it at its face, then we can really figure out a way to maybe unravel that a little bit and examine that, so we can avoid the uglier ends of that when wars do occur. Like, wars are going to happen as long as there's a hint of tribalism or a hint of economic drive for them, or pick any number of reasons. There's going to be armed conflict between people, and I don't know that I can ever realistically take a stance to suggest that can't be, that won't be the case. Not anytime soon. As Karl Marlantes, he's got a great, I quote him in the book. He says, a lot of people assume or think that the military turns people into killing machines. It doesn't. It's a finishing school. We walk into the military with these kind of innate behaviors, and all the military does is take those things and aims them, no pun intended, in a direction for their own needs, either politically or what have you. So, we do this to ourselves. I mean, we really do. This is us, and we have to examine that.
That's very true. I remember, just flashing real fast back to my own basic training experience. I would have never envisioned myself running with a bayonet at a rubber dummy, shouting "Kill a commie for mommy." I mean, I'm sorry, to be blunt about it, but that's how it was back in the 80s. That was me, the raw material being groomed into this fighting machine, like you say. And yeah.
I think a really good book on the subject, if people have any interest, is I forget his first name, but his last name is Grossman. It's called On Killing. And it looks at the psychological effects of killing in battlefields, and it shows kind of it's a really good piece of literature on, how the military creates people who do these things, and also the attitudes that come into the military that the military just takes advantage of. It's a really good piece of work. I think he was a West Point psychologist. I think that's true. Don't quote me on that, but he did really good work on it.
Well, let me ask another question, if there are not any others out there right now. Let's kind of talk about your transition out of the military. What that was like, going from, you talk about the civil military divide, whether that does or doesn't exist, but your transition out of the military back into the civilian sector. Obviously, you'd come through this experience of war. And so now you're going back into the real world, as you put it. And so what was that like? What was going through your head and your life then?
I was looking forward to it. But I had a lot of expectations of it that were not really met. And I think on a interpersonal level, I didn't have a lot of struggle. I was a very, very, I took the Marine Corps with a softer touch, I think, at times. And so when I left the military, I was able to transition a little bit, I think a little bit easier in that regard. A lot of people, to reference Platoon, I kind of went into the Marine Corps with a very Chris Taylor attitude. I was there. I wanted to be involved with it, but I was somewhat disconnected from it. I was a participant just as much as I was an observer, and there are aspects of me that are very much Marine. That's, that I wouldn't even begin to dispute that. But I think on a social level, I had little struggles. Where I had some tough time was one of the things that I've noticed, and I've been thinking a lot about this even lately, is there was a tendency to be very stereotyping. I think, I am a veteran and therefore I must adhere to a certain set of characteristics that are typically deleterious. And I found that remarkably alienating. And that wasn't from people who had ill intent. It just, when they heard I was a Marine or they heard I was a veteran, my politics were kind of assumed to a certain degree, or, I became a kind of, a kind of a bucket of sorts for people's ideas about the country. If they had negative attitudes about the war, they would assume those negative attitudes applied to me, or that I was a sort of embodiment of the things that causes those.
Right. I think at one point you called yourself like an avatar.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I was kind of an avatar of a lot of identity there, a lot of that identity, and I struggle with that. I think the worst thing, it's almost a pet peeve, is if somebody assumes an attitude or a perception or a point about me that fits to a stereotype and not to what I actually think or believe. And that was something I struggle with. And I see that, and I wonder if that doesn't in part sort of demonstrate why veterans end up sort of kind of cloistering around like-minded individuals, namely the veterans, why you have these groups that form, because when they go outside of that, they get kind of reduced to this very, very two-dimensional binary, or a very two-dimensional figure. Right. And they can't just be themselves in the world anymore. They have to adhere to this. And then also there's PTSD that's involved with that. And there's a lot of the group dynamics of the military is very powerful. And so those aspects of it were definitely at play. Now, I had good friends who had left the military already and sort of helped me sort of unravel some of the stuff that I was feeling and going through. A friend of mine from my journalism school, an Air Force veteran who I went to a journalism school for the military with, was a big help there. My friend Ken, who I talk about in the book, he was a big help and still is to this day. I talk to him probably once or twice a week. So I was very fortunate to have people who knew me even before the Marine Corps, who could sort of quietly, who knew that I was more than just the veteran. And those folks really were really helpful. But that was probably the biggest struggle, I think, was trying to just, Kool-Aid man my way through the stereotypes. That was a big struggle.
It can be tough. And like you say, we do get pigeonholed into these, whether it's by media, whether it's by culture, or just, the assimilation of, the military fabric of our society, the wars assimilation into our society too. And might even be just a little bit of a pendulum swinging back the other way from the way veterans were treated during the Vietnam War era too.
Sure. And I think there's a certain amount of guilt that comes from that, that's being sort of blanketed over with a lot of the platitudes that we see now. Right.
Mm-hmm. So Megan, are there any other questions that have come in?
Yeah, there's another one. It says, military is oftentimes put on a pedestal by the American people as if it can do no wrong. The case of Eddie Gallagher is maybe a good example of that. Does a military-civilian divide exist in America today? If so, what about it needs fixing?
Oh, what was the last bit of that? I'm sorry.
If so, what about it needs fixing?
Well, I would say right off the bat, one thing that I've been really, angling on is there seems to be this idea that the best way to demonstrate patriotism is to pick up a rifle and go overseas and fight in a war. And I find it hard to believe that we can't assume that somebody who works at a food bank isn't patriotic, or somebody who helps in their community isn't patriotic. Those things are incredibly, they help us directly, and I think that we need to kind of come to an understanding that those people should be as elevated just as equally as a soldier who subscribes to a certain set of values that we find righteous. That I think it would be a huge help. I also think that one way of eliminating that divide, and it's probably a polemic way, but I think that one of the attributes, the reason why we saw such a fervent anti-war demonstration in Vietnam is because we were fighting a war that people understood was not right, but they were being they were obligated to fight in it. They were being drafted to do so, and that created that tension between the democratic tension between the government and the people. And it forced the government to make some, or at least aspects of the government, to make some hard choices about the wars it fights. Once we got rid of the draft, that goes away. The average American has no longer has a requirement to be involved in its foreign policy, and so we can fight wars for 20 years without batting an eye, because somebody else will go fight that, and the average American doesn't have to get involved. I don't fault the average American their issues for doing that, because politics tends to be local. They worry about politics on a local level. The things that matter to them are things that affect them directly, and if the war does not affect them, they're not going to. It's not going to register high enough in their list of things to be concerned about to do something about. So I think that some form of obligatory service would probably adjust that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean military service. It could mean something very similar to a civilian conservation corps. It could go a number of different angles, but it would plug the American people back into the behaviors of its country at large. And I think that would have a huge help.
It looks like those are all the questions from the audience. David, did you have any more?
Just kind of maybe to wrap up the kind of the obligatory one. Are you working on anything else right now? And you mentioned fiction in the past, or you've written fiction in the past and published a novella, but are you dabbling in that direction, or what's on your plate, Jerad?
Well, I am really close. I feel really close to being done with a novel. I'm editing the back 40,000 of it now. I've written the whole thing. I just need to, make it, as you well know, you got to go over it 6 million times and make sure everything's doing what it's supposed to do. And, if you bring a gun into it, you got to have it do something later, that kind of all the typical traits and tricks. I need to make sure all those things are taken care of. So I want to try to have that done sometime after the new year. I have ideas for 2 more nonfiction books and also another novel. So I've got a dance card that's kind of full.
I was about to say, you've got a full plate coming up. That's exciting to hear. That's really exciting to hear. And in the meantime, we can enjoy all of your wonderful words that you put together in Volunteers. And again, thanks for writing that, and thanks to the bookstore for hosting this event.
Yeah, it looks like we've reached the top of the hour, but thank you again to Jerad and David for joining us on At Home with Literati. A reminder to the audience that you can purchase Volunteer. The link is in the chat. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.